Almost overnight, she went from a possible witness to a person of interest in the case of a missing mom of 5 from New Canaan. The girlfriend in the middle of a bitter and brutal divorce battle.
The stuff you were throwing out, we have. And it's all Jennifer. It belongs to Jennifer. Do you understand?
Turned high-profile murder investigation.
Guys, what happened to Jennifer Michelle?
We're taking you inside the trial of Michelle Troconis.
And thanks for joining us once again for Inside the Trial of Michelle Troconis. I'm Shannon Miller. We are heading into our first full day of jury deliberations in Stamford. 6 jurors will now decide if Michelle Troconis is guilty or not guilty on each of the 6 charges she faces. They got the case late Tuesday afternoon. Judge Kevin Randolph went over instructions on each charge before sitting the jury into the deliberation room. The jury is set to report at 10 a.m. today. Here is some of what they will be considering. There were 27 days of testimony in the trial. That includes about 9 hours of interviews Michelle Troconis had with police, which were played in full for the jury. There's also some 230 exhibits which were brought into the deliberation room, so they'll be able to look at that evidence while they make their decision. And for the first time, we heard from start to finish the narrative the state presented over the last 6 weeks in Stamford in closing arguments. Prosecutors laid it all out for the jury and for all of those in that packed courtroom. The defense pushing back on all evidence, calling it all speculation and no facts. Each side got an hour, but the prosecution was able to split their closing argument into 2 parts.
Fotis needed help to commit that murder. He needed an alibi. He needed the defendant.
Michelle simply did not know.
Now, a reminder of the 6 charges Michelle Troconis faces, all felonies, the most serious being conspiracy to commit murder. She's also charged with 2 counts of tampering with physical evidence, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit tampering with physical evidence, and 1 count of hindering prosecution. The defendant has maintained her innocence throughout the years since Jennifer Dulos disappeared and has pleaded not guilty. And now her fate on those 6 charges is in the hands of the jury. ABC Connecticut's Kevin Geis joins us now live outside Stamford Superior Court once again. And Kevin, the closing arguments were emotional, intense, and even fiery at times.
Absolutely, Shannon, but they were also methodical. The state, for the first time, laying out in one linear line all of the evidence that they presented over the course of about 5 weeks of different testimony and evidence they were bringing into the case. But, of course, the defense, during their closing argument, cutting some of the strings the state was using to tie their entire case together. Let's start with the conspiracy to commit murder charge. The prosecution alleging Michelle Troconis answering the so-called alibi call from Fotis Dulos' friend from Greece is proof she was in on the plot to kill Jennifer. Now, you may remember the state claims Fotis texted Andreas Toutsiarides the night before to arrange a phone call establishing an alibi for him. Troconis didn't mention that phone call in her first 2 interviews, but in her third, she admitted to picking up the call in the office after Kent Mawhinney told her to.
Look at all the text messages that were not answered that morning and all the phone calls that were not answered except for one, the planned one. Make no mistake, she knew exactly what she was doing when she answered that phone. How do you know? It was planned, the timing, but also she doesn't talk about the call at all in her first 2 interviews. After all, the call is not on her alibi script, and make no mistake, we call them timelines, but they are alibi scripts.
Troconis' attorney, John Schoenhorn, bringing up that his client was suspicious that Fotis Dulos was saving women's phone numbers under men's names in his phone, and that may have been why she picked it up. Now, the prosecution also pointing to these phone manipulation events you may remember investigators testifying about weeks ago. You can see despite Fotis Dulos leaving his phone in Farmington, someone was unlocking and rotating the phone multiple times the morning of the 24th. The prosecution says that shows Michelle Troconis was in on the plan to kill his estranged wife and helped him try to establish an alibi.
The only person who could have reasonably manipulated Fotis Dulos' phone that morning is Michelle Troconis. There was some evidence of Kent Mawhinney. He came to the office at 7:21 and 8:41. But the phone was manipulated before 7:21, before he arrives, and it was manipulated after he leaves. The defendant is the only person who could have reasonably manipulated that phone, and the only person who had reason.
Now, the state did point out that a lot of evidence in this case is circumstantial, but they say nonetheless it does prove Michelle Troconis was involved in the plot, or it was just a bunch of coincidences.
Is it just a coincidence that the defendant followed Fotis Dulos to the car wash and then tried to lie about it? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant's phone number and not Dulos' number was used at the car wash? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant lied and said she showered with Dulos when he was actually en route to murder his wife?
Now, Shannon, this went on for a while. Attorney Sean McGinnis asked the jurors if it was all coincidences for about 5 minutes straight.
All right, so Kevin, let's get through some of the other charges related to tampering. Count one for both the tampering with evidence and the conspiracy to commit tampering charges relates to what the defendant is accused of doing on May 24th. The trips back and forth from 80 Mountain Spring Road property, which the prosecution says was to dispose of evidence. And then, of course, the video captured along Albany Avenue in Hartford, the state claiming Troconis knew what her boyfriend was dumping, bags filled of evidence with Jennifer's DNA on it. Now, when it comes to the second count of both tampering with evidence and the conspiracy to commit tampering charges, that's related to the car wash trip on May 29th. The state alleging Troconis knowingly helped Fotis Dulos remove evidence from the Tacoma by bringing him to the car wash, and the state says having him leave her phone number. Now, the impact, the state alleges, was a lack of physical evidence found inside that Tacoma when it was processed. The state also argues that the car wash events prove her guilt on hindering prosecution. A closer look now at the defense's closing arguments. One of the biggest moments for the defense in those interviews that Michelle Troconis gave to police is this admission made by then state's attorney Richard Colangelo.
How did I justify it?
Now, you hear Colangelo say in that video to investigators in Michelle's second interview, "I don't think she knows." As the state's top prosecutor, Colangelo was in charge of bringing this case to trial. He is not in charge anymore, but Attorney John Schoenhorn argues those words from the prosecutor's own mouth exonerate his client.
Here's the state's attorney, the chief law enforcement officer for this judicial district, saying she doesn't know. Maybe she doesn't know, and you've got the three detectives telling him something that's false to get him to come off the notion that she doesn't go. And I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, if he thought she didn't know, then that's reasonable doubt right there.
Also, an important witness for the state faced criticism from the defense in closing arguments. Pavel Gumieni, who was granted immunity for his testimony. Attorney John Schoenhorn brought up that despite the doubts and suspicions he had about his employer, Fotis Dulos, he still went through great efforts to change out the seats in his Toyota Tacoma.
Despite all these red flags, doing all these things, after Fotis told him he wants him to do this because there may be some of DNA of Jennifer in his vehicle, he does it anyway, even with full immunity from prosecution, which the judge will talk to you about. He still insisted to you in questioning that he did not believe that Fotis would harm Jennifer. He knew more than Michelle did, and he still did his bidding.
Now, Schoenhorn also brought up the vulgar statements Gumieni claimed Michelle Troconis made about Jennifer Dulos. Sergeant Allegro testified that during his 8-hour interview with Gumieni, he asked about whether Fotis Dulos used derogatory words when referring to Jennifer.
He used those exact words, effing bitch, okay? Pavel said, nope, never heard that. But that would have been the time. But I remember Michelle Troconis saying something like that. That didn't even jog his memory about that. So I suggest to you that that part, the part about that he referred to her in derogatory terms, was made up after he got a signed immunity agreement to sort of ingratiate himself. Because remember, it's not just that he's been given immunity for his testimony, he's been given a get-out-of-jail pass for anything that he may have done in connection with hiding evidence. And he knew why he was taking the seats out of his car at Dulos' request.
Now, Schoenhorn also pointed out the Ford Raptor's infotainment system only accounts for Gumieni in New Canaan working at that Doulos property up till about 12:30. But it goes dark until around 4:20 p.m. when the truck is back in the Plainville area. Troconis' attorney called into question what Gumieni's role may have been and brought up that connection of Jennifer's phone to her Suburban shortly before 3 p.m. when Fotis Doulos was already back in Farmington, according to the state. That insinuation that Gumieni may have had more involvement drew a fiery reaction from attorney McGinnis.
If you're going to have the temerity in closing argument to accuse someone of being involved in a murder, at least have the brass to ask them when they're here on cross-examination.
Objection, Your Honor.
Well, at this point, the court can appreciate Fella's argument, but ad hominem attacks should not be considered by the jury. Neither should they continue.
Now, Kevin, Gumieni's testimony is critical to the state's case. Talk about how they defended his credibility amid that immunity deal.
Right, so the state essentially uses Gumieni to sort of prove some motive for Michelle Troconis, too, to have some animosity toward Jennifer Doulos. He testified about some of the comments that she made before Jennifer's disappearance as well as after. But the state sort of pushed back and said Pavel Gumieni, despite having an immunity deal and despite sort of having to face cross-examination from John Schoenhorn, still stood the entire trial. He endured an entire day of cross-examination and testimony. If you remember, at the very beginning of his testimony, he described that he was nervous to be here in the first place. So they sort of pushed back on the defense's assertion that he may not be the most credible witness by saying he sat in this courtroom and talked to the jurors directly and answered questions for almost 2 days straight. So the jurors should take that into consideration when they consider Pavel Gumieni's credibility.
Also, Kevin, why did the defense also bring up the name of Kent Mawhinney, who is charged as a co-conspirator to Jennifer's murder, and what his role could have been in all this?
Right, so Kent Mawhinney did not testify in this trial, so he sort of is a name that the jurors have heard a few times through various testimony and involved in various evidence, but he never actually answered questions in this case. So John Schoenhorn brings up Kent Mawhinney to leave sort of questions in jurors' minds as to who was involved in this plot, how many people were involved, and sort of how many holes could have been filled if they had some answers from Kent Mawhinney. So it's just continuing to push toward that reasonable doubt threshold that Schoenhorn is trying to get these jurors to reach so that they ultimately come back with not guilty verdicts.
All right, Kevin, I want to talk now about the emotional heart of the case. Jennifer Doulos. Prosecutors showed this photo of a smiling Jennifer surrounded by her 5 children. The kids were in the courtroom yesterday for those closing arguments, accompanied by their nanny, Lauren Almeida, who testified early on in the trial.
What this case is really about. It is about a mother's worst nightmare. It is about a mother being taken away from her children in life or in death. It is about Petros, Theodore, Christiane, Constantine, and Noel, who went to bed on May 24th not knowing where their mother was, and she has still not arrived.
Attorney Schoenhorn also mentioning the children in his closing argument and how their father, Fotis Doulos, left them with so many unanswered questions. Schoenhorn bringing back up Fotis' death certificate, which showed the jury once again was suicide checked off on the form.
Fotis put up a facade until his last poisoned breath, and he died without ever acknowledging his actions or admitting his role even to his own children. He never gave answers, and he can't be held to answer. Everyone wants closure. Michelle is not the remaining half of a scheming plot.
So, Kevin, let's talk more about the emotion in the closing arguments from both sides. Well, the jury's decision needs to be rooted in evidence. Appealing to their emotions as human beings is important as well.
Absolutely. We can't see jurors, we can't hear jurors through any of the live stream, but the attorneys know that they are human. So, of course, they're catering to sort of that emotion, trying to elicit some sympathy for certain parties one way or another. But the judge makes very clear, even in his instructions to jurors before they started deliberations, that they cannot take sympathy into account. They can't take emotion into account. They are fact finders. They have to spend their deliberations focused exactly on facts and facts only.
All right, Kevin, let's take a look now and listen to the final words from both sides to the jury, starting with the defense. Attorney John Schoenhorn telling the jury this trial is without a doubt a tragedy for everyone involved, but it's also proof, and he says the state failed at reaching that burden, providing all speculation, and according to Schoenhorn, no facts.
You may think that the state has a second bite of the apple. That's not fair, but it's important for you to understand the reason for this is they have the burden of proof on everything. We don't. So they do get to speak last, but I want you just to remember that they have a burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt for each element of each of the crimes the judge is going to read to you, and I ask that you reach the correct verdict, which is not guilty.
Now let's take a look here at the final word from the state attorney McGinnis, showing the jury the handwritten timelines one last time before they head into deliberations. He says while they were referred to as timelines, they were really scripts, calling the jurors back to high school English class. He said every script has 3 acts.
The first act was the premeditation and killing of Jennifer Dulos. The second act was the cover-up through the destruction of evidence and the defendant's lies. And now we've reached the third act, except she doesn't get to write it. You do. You write the third act of this script with your verdict. What's the ending going to be?
So, Kevin, the jury had a chance to very briefly meet yesterday, deliberating for about a half hour. So what does today look like for them when they return there to the courthouse?
Right, so yesterday they really had a chance to elect a 4-person and sort of introduce themselves to one another. It's important to remember that throughout this entire trial, Judge Kevin Randolph made very clear that they were not to discuss the case at any point. They went back into the deliberation room. So yesterday was really the first time they had the chance to discuss a little bit about what they had seen over the course of 6 weeks in total. So today they'll really start to be able to push through some of that evidence. At the very end of yesterday, they even asked for an easel to sort of work through some of the details. So today will really be the first time they'll get to dive in to over 200 exhibits of evidence.
That jury going to get to know each other on a much deeper level in the hours and potentially days to come. Kevin Geist live for us once again outside Stamford Superior Court. Coming up next inside the trial of Michelle Troconis, we will talk again with attorney Jim Bergen about his takeaways from closing arguments for both sides. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Inside the Trial of Michelle Troconis. We are joined once again by attorney Jim Bergen, partner at Shipman and Goodwin, who handles personal injury and criminal cases and also teaches attorneys on how to perform in situations like we saw yesterday during closing arguments. Jim, what are the overall goals with closing arguments, the strategy involved, especially when it comes to that 1-hour time limit and the way the state's allowed to split up their arguments into 2 different portions?
Well, the first minute in any trial advocacy course, I tell everybody it's all about credibility. You have to enhance your credibility and build your credibility. So now, when it comes to a summation, you have to tell a story. You got to tell it in chronological, because that's how we live. That's how things happen. You tell a story, and you have to have a theme, and you got to stay on your theme. You state it, it's the first thing that comes out of your mouth. It's the last thing that comes out of your mouth, and you say that same thing 2 to 3 times during your summation. Then, by limiting yourself to those points that actually propel your view, you hit hard your best points, but you include all your weak points in the story. So the jury understands, oh yeah, that fits, that makes sense. So that's your time. That's the best time you have. And I think the theme that was not used here, which would have helped, I had a theme myself, which is never underestimate a dangerous sociopath, because she underestimated it But he did point out she didn't know. She didn't know. That's good. That's a theme.
And we've all known people that have changed eventually. I want to talk again about time, because the time is different for each side. The state able to pick up their arguments on two different fronts, and Schoenhorn letting the jury know that his time constraints are a little bit different. I want to take you to a soundbite now, or he tells the jury that.
I have bullet points that I want to cover. It would have been great if I had an extra 4 or 5 minutes, but there was a lot to cover in a 6-week plus trial. So.
Now, back to the state. They eventually laid out this full narrative. We talk about, the witnesses were kind of came at different parts of this case, but together in that final argument, the state laid everything out in chronological order. It is compelling, but is there enough evidence, of course, for the conviction is what the jury is going to have to decide. Have they been able to prove that Michelle Troconis knew what was going on and then was actually in on it? That's what they've got to prove here.
That's right. But the state did a very good job. They split their time well. Each of the prosecutors did a very strong job. And the part that they saved for the end, the rebuttal, which is unrebuttable by the defense, they just went through the litany of facts in essentially a chronological order. And so their theme seemed to be they acted as one. And then it was just point, 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 point. Now, every one of those points supported their theme. That doesn't mean that she's guilty, but, the defense doesn't have a chance to explain why, and that's why the defense has to capitalize on its chance to tell the whole story, include the weak points, but show it chronologically and stick with his theme.
Help the jury just wrap their minds around how all of this happened in the order of events. So back to the defense. Were the closing arguments effective? What worked and what didn't work here for John Schoenhorn?
Every time he focused on Michelle Troconis's mindset, it was effective. It was very effective when he points out to Colangelo himself, told us all his view of her mindset. She didn't know. Like, you never get that. In my 40-plus years, I've never seen nor heard of it. You get the prosecution's head saying she didn't know, which is the only issue in the case. So he hit that well. Where it lost his opportunity to enhance his own credibility is when he spent some time defending Fotis, which to me is the opposite of what you want to do. You want to make him exactly what everybody knows. He's a sociopath. He's dangerous. And by defending him, not only is he wasting his own time and credibility, he's separating himself from the jury, because there's nobody in that courtroom that didn't think the guy is crazy and horrible. Yeah. So why associate yourself with that when you really just want to associate yourself with this lovely, lovely woman who loved children? That's what you want to do. That's your theme.
I want to go back to another name that was brought up, Pavel Gumieri. A lot of time spent on him and his credibility, the defense alluding to him possibly playing a bigger role in all of this. So what's the reasoning behind that? And did you think that any of McGinnis's response to this, which garnered an objection eventually from Attorney John Schoenhorn, worked?
I'm saying that was part of his theme, and I thought it worked. I think for Pavel to have sat there for 8 hours, told everything he could, and doesn't include this unbelievable, damaging fact about, oh, that effing bitch. Well, on the other hand, the thought that I thought it would have been very nice for him to remind people, she only said that in the context of she wouldn't let the children see the dog before the dog was buried and taken down. And she was just angered about that lack of caring. So she said those words, but it wasn't because she just thinks she's that way. It's because she was concerned about hurting the children, not being able to have closure. So I think that really had to be part of the story.
As with any loads of information, context is so key, and that'll be crucial for that jury when they go back there. More analysis from Jim Bergen coming up. Next, we'll go over the task ahead for the jury. Stay with us. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to Inside the Trial of Michelle Troconis. We are joined once again by attorney Jim Bergen, partner at Shipman & Goodwin, again, who handles personal injury in those criminal cases. Jim, let's talk about a half hour from now, that jury going to be headed back to that deliberation room. They got about a half hour together yesterday. They've got those 6 charges, so 6 separate decisions that they've got to make. 200 plus exhibits in this case, weeks and weeks of testimony to think about. So these juries, everyone is different. Every single case is different. Every single jury that's seated is different. But how do they start to approach their deliberations going through all of this?
Well, I am not allowed to sit in with a jury, but I have conducted dozens and dozens of mock juries and watched them deliberate so that we can better understand what's going to work and not work with the jury. And I've never seen 2 the same. It's just a bunch of human beings, and they are their entire own authority. They decide how they're going to do it. Whatever they decide, that's okay in terms of who gets to talk, how. In the end, however, they have to respect each other because it's got to be unanimous. That feature about unanimity really makes it hard work. You've got to get everybody to come down on the same page on each of those counts.
What I think is interesting, too, is over the last 6 weeks, they've probably talked to each other about everything under the sun except for the trial. But now they can really see where each other stands on the case and really get a feel for how each of them saw this case through each of their own eyes. The million-dollar question, I can't keep track of how many times I've been asked so far. How long will deliberations take? You know, our guess is just about as good as anyone else's because, again, every case is unique. Every jury is unique as well.
Well, I'll start out by saying I have no idea, absolutely no idea. If somebody said, here's $1,000, you have to bet on something, I would bet Friday, but it could be today, it could be next week. But the fact that they get to do 3 full days and then they got to go through a weekend, I think they're all going to have that little clock. They want to get rid of this thing because they can't even talk to their spouses. They can't talk to their friends. It's weird. Yeah. So that's what I would guess. And in terms of what they do, again, I have to be forced to bet because otherwise I really don't know. I do think that my money would be on not guilty on the murder. My money, only because I have to, would be, say, guilty on the hindering, even though personally I understand the presumption of innocence. And if this case were handled the way I think it could have been handled, there would always be reasonable doubt. I can't imagine Fotis ever hinting to his girlfriend, who's going to hopefully take care of these kids, that he could even be potentially a killer. So, and all the other people at the trial, every single person in this whole courtroom never saw him do anything violent. So she's just never imagining it. That's, for me, I don't think she's guilty, but I do believe if I had to put my money down, I'd put my money down on hindering.
Attorney John Schoenhorn saying outside the courthouse yesterday, the hardest part now, waiting. How do you prepare a client for, in this moment? Seconds probably seem like hours to Michelle Troconis. Days are going to seem like weeks for her and her family waiting on this verdict, I would think. How do you prepare a client for the waiting game?
Well, you have to be respectful of their own feelings. You do what you would do if, somebody's dog died, for example. You show empathy. I always use humor, but not humor like too much because then it seems disrespectful, but you try to keep it light and let them express how they're feeling. They've got to process it. And at that point, the lawyer's doing nothing. We're just trying to be nice people.
Yeah, and these are those final moments that the two of them will have together, attorney and client.
That's right. Yeah.
Anything else, Jim, as we head into what could be, again, hours, days of deliberations? This case unique to Connecticut, so many moving parts to it. Do you think it's going to set any sort of a precedent at all in the state of Connecticut?
Well, I think this judge really set a very high bar for judges. I mean, if all judges acted the way this guy did, it would be really good. And the idea that he opened it all up, he was confident. He's, by the way, a very humble personality. How you see him, that's just how he is normally. But he had the guts to say, you know what, I'll open it up. Even when I'm talking to the lawyers about the instructions, I'll open it up. Nobody's ever done that. But he did it with grace. And he also, like, for example, in the summation, where there was that objection, he sustained the objection. But he did it in a way that didn't level the prosecutor. And, you know, he tried to just explain his answer by saying, well, you know, I understand the argument, but you're really not supposed to attack a human being. So he gets it.
He does, and he's going to be that guiding voice for the jury moving forward, helping guide them through this process.
Yes.
Jen, we appreciate all of your insight over the course of the last 6 weeks. Incredible perspective on a high-profile case that has captured Connecticut's attention and beyond our state. And that wraps up our exclusive Inside the Trial of Michelle Troconis streaming special. We will have live coverage on NBC Connecticut and our streaming channels when a verdict is reached. We look forward to seeing you again. Thanks for watching.